Hello and welcome to End Zone Focus. I'm Allan Lee. Well, as far as news is concerned, the world's a busy place at the moment. We have US elections, Afghanistan, China's influence in the Pacific, and New Zealand's bidding for a place on the UN Security Council, which raises the question, where does New Zealand fit in? And what effect will these major events elsewhere have on us in our little corner of the world? Well, if anyone knows, it's our guest on this week's programme, Dr. Paul Buchanan. He's a former intelligence and policy analyst for the US government. He's taught at universities all over the world, and he's one of the brains behind 36 Parallel Assessments, a geopolitical risk and strategic assessment consultancy. And he's our guest today. Dr. Buchanan, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's start with the Security Council. We're bidding for a place on the UN Security Council. That the bid is going through. The first vote is this week. What are our chances?
Not very good, because the competition is extremely hard, particularly in the case of Turkey. Turkey needs to be recognized as the emerging great power that it is. And so I have a feeling that we're just up against a formidable opponent. Unfortunately, we actually were a bit undone by the Australians, yet again perhaps, in that normally Canada, Australia, and New Zealand sequence their applications, their bids for the non-permanent seats in the Security Council. And the agreement was Canada would go in 2010, New Zealand would go in 2012, and Australia would go in 2014. Well, due to something on the Australian side, they decided to make their bid in 2012. Jumped ahead of us in the queue. And that's going to wind up undermining both bids, because the Australians are identified as being too close to the United States. And so it's an assured vote for anything the United States moves in the Council. And we've been pushed into competing with Turkey and Spain. Spain is not so much a worry because of the poor economic conditions the Spaniards are facing, although their diplomacy is good. But the Turks are simply an emerging great power and need to be recognized as such.
You talk about our relationship with the United States. That seems to be getting closer after decades of it being fairly cool. We've had the Defence Secretary, Leon Panetta, visiting Wellington. Certainly the relationship between the US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and John Key at the Pacific Island Forum in Rarotonga, that seemed very warm indeed. So is that relationship warmer than it has been?
It has. The warming started after 9/11. And at that point, the Americans needed all the friends they could get, both for the prosecution of the war against Islamicist extremism, and then in the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, even though we, I think smartly, did not join in the combat activities involved in that particular venture. But the Labor government started to thaw that relationship after 25 years of a cool, it wasn't a completely cold relationship. For example, in intelligence matters, we continued to be very closely aligned with the United States, both in the Echelon network, which has been in the news, but also in human intelligence collaboration and the like. After 9/11, Labor responded to American overtures. We have to be very clear that it was the Americans who reached out in those very troubling times, and that relationship has steadily developed and then really was brought into fruition by the national government, which clearly has a pro-American bent to it. John Key is a big fan of the United States in many respects, and so he took a personal interest in reestablishing a bilateral relationship with the United States that was as good as those that, for example, the Australians maintain. And he's well on his way towards achieving that, because with the Wellington Declaration of 2011 and now the Washington Declaration of 2012, we've resumed virtually in every capacity bilateral military-to-military relations after 30 years of estrangement. And again, the intelligence relationship is now first tier. We play with the big boys on the big stage, and I think we need to be cognizant of that.
How much of that warming is is due to the US realizing that China's influence in the Pacific and in our region appears to be strengthening all the time. And we're the only country that has a free trade agreement with China.
True, and I think it has a lot to do with the improved relationship between the United States and New Zealand. These things don't occur in a vacuum. And the strategic competition between the United States as the sole superpower and China as the emerging great power with the potential to be the next superpower puts us, squarely in the middle of what, could call a strategic sandwich. That is, the United States has announced that it's going to pivot, that was the word they used, its attention towards the Western Pacific. And that, of course, then reverses years of orientation towards the Atlantic. And you can see this, for example, in that 60% of U.S. naval assets are now being deployed into the Pacific and away from the Atlantic, which was their traditional purview. Diplomatically, economically, the United States increasingly sees its fortunes tied to emerging Asia. And, but at the same time, it is worried about Chinese influence because, to be honest, the United States and the Chinese do not see eye to eye on many issues, some of which move into the field of morality and ethics. It's not just a realpolitik concern of one power vis-a-vis another, but there's fundamental disagreements in the approach to life, if you will. And so that's the next big strategic competition, and New Zealand is uniquely positioned to either benefit or be punished by that competition because we are the first Western country that has a bilateral trade agreement with the Chinese. And the Chinese, I think, are using New Zealand as a bit as a laboratory rat. You start out with a very small country with a very open market and try the bilateral there, see if it works, and then move on to bigger markets that may exhibit similar trade characteristics. And we'll see how that goes. It certainly has benefited our exporters, but the United States has tried to allay that growing relationship and counterbalance it with a tightening of security ties. I'm not entirely sure that it's tenable for New Zealand over the long term to straddle the fence between a trade orientation that is increasingly Asia-centric and China-centric in particular, and a first-tier security relationship with the United States, given the fact that the United States and China are also military competitors. So we may be the meat in a sandwich that will come undone down the road.
China says, it was the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister, he said, China is not in the Pacific to seek any particular influence, much less dominance. We are not in the Pacific to compete with anybody. That's just words, isn't it?
You know what? It reminds me of Minister Murray McCully said at an international forum earlier this year, I believe. He said that New Zealand is enemies of none and friends of many. And when I heard that, I thought, so you're not enemies of Al-Qaeda? You're not enemies of child slavery types? You're not enemies of rogue states, proliferators, and the like? This is sort of a kindergarten comment. But it's very similar to the Vice Minister's comment. The idea that an emerging great power would not seek to influence anybody in a region in which it has not had influence, quite frankly, fails the sniff test. What China has done, it's used economic diplomacy, also known as checkbook diplomacy, to promote its interests throughout the South Pacific to include New Zealand and Australia, not just the island states. And it's been very effective at doing so. It does not need to project military force at a time when it's militarily weaker than the United States, when it can use its economic might to win friends and influence people.
But it's not afraid to take on, say, Japan or Korea with those disputed islands in the East China Sea, that it's more than willing to rattle the sabers there.
Well, that gets into Chinese strategic logics and in particular their naval strategy. They have something known as the three island chains, which are basically, if you think about it, are arcs extending out from the mainland China well into the Pacific. The first island chain, which they consider to be their innermost defense, includes the South China Sea. And so those islands, in fact, they have territorial claims on Malaysia, they have territorial claims on Brunei, They have claims on islands that are within sight of the shorelines of Malaysia and Brunei and the Philippines. And the only country abutting the South China Sea that does not have a direct conflict with the Chinese about some territory is Singapore. Everybody else is in an argument with the Chinese, and they fear the Chinese. I've just come back from spending 4 years in Singapore, and even though they're an ethnically Chinese-dominant country, it's quite clear that for all of these nations, be it Vietnam, Malaysia, again, the 7 countries that have territorial disputes with the Chinese about islands in the South China Sea, that is their gravest concern. But let's look at it from the Chinese perspective. If you're going to be a great power, you must be able to extend your naval influence into the near offshore at a minimum. You have to do that, and that's what they're doing right now.
Let's talk a bit about China in New Zealand. We'll do that after we've taken a commercial break. But for now, Dr. Buchanan, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Our guest on the programme is Dr. Paul Buchanan, and we'll be back in just a moment. And welcome back to End Zone Focus. Our guest on the programme today is Foreign Affairs Analyst Dr. Paul Buchanan from 36 Parallel Assessments. Before the break, Dr. Buchanan, we were talking about China and its influence in the Pacific. Now, there's been a lot of interest in recent days about the giant telecommunications company that comes out of China, Huawei, and their influence on our own ultra-fast broadband network. What are the concerns about having such a big Chinese company, which allegedly is a free market company? What are the concerns with having that company involved with our ultra-fast broadband network?
Well, the main concerns appear to be that it serves as a front for Chinese intelligence, and that it installs, as a matter of course, backdoor devices, also known as beacons, that can be operationalized sometime in the future and data mine specific targets within that broadband network. Now, to date, no hard evidence has been produced, although the U.S. House of Representatives has just issued a congressional report that has a 12-page classified annex that I would assume is being shared with the New Zealand government, because the New Zealand government, of course, is an intelligence partner of the United States, and particularly a signals intelligence partner of the United States. So if the Chinese are using Huawei as some sort of front, then they would have an interest in accessing our broadband networks to try to get information about that network. One way to do so would be to tap into the personal computers of decision makers, both corporate and political, and use the personal computer as a backdoor entryway into the work computer. Now, my understanding is that the Government Communications Security Bureau has given outright assurances to the Prime Minister that they're onto this, that they've taken whatever measures are necessary to prevent the installation of such bugs. If that is true, then they've done better than the UK, they've done better than the Canadians, they've done better than the Australians, and now apparently the Americans think that there's some issues with their own broadband network. But we do have to remember this. When you have a very large broadband network, it's very, very easy to install bugs and miles of cable handling zillions of bits of data. And thus it's quite hard for host governments to uncover all those bugs. But in a very small market like New Zealand, although it is easier to target individuals and agencies, it's also easier to discover them because of the small size of the infrastructure network. And I think that is what is giving the GCSB some assurance that if Huawei was to play loose with the terms of the contract on behalf of the Chinese state, that they'll be able to detect this. And of course, that from a enterprise standpoint could well be the kiss of death for Huawei, because there's been no smoking gun as of yet. There's been a lot of allegations in the West. But were something to be discovered concrete in New Zealand, that would kill them off.
I did hear it argued that the reason that the Americans were against Huawei was because it was old-fashioned protectionism. You know, they were taking work away from American telecom companies, who obviously would have liked the same contract. Is there an element of that? Is it the West saying, "Oh, we don't want another big player in our sandpit"? Well,
the answer actually is yes and no. Obviously, commercial considerations come into effect. But let's remember, the United States is this enormous market. There's plenty of room for everybody to play. That sandbox is huge. The real concern of a corporate sort is that Huawei is not a good corporate actor. It does not play by the international market rules, and the specific allegations in the U.S. congressional report was that it engages in bribery and corruption in order to get contracts, and then it engages in copyright violation and intellectual property theft. Now, normally when there's disputes of that sort amongst Western countries, they sue each other. But we have to remember that in China, you don't have an independent judiciary, you do not have an independent legislature that can serve as an oversight mechanism, and telecommunications is one of the 12 strategic sectors identified by the Chinese regime as being of national importance. So the assumption is if telecommunications are essential for Chinese power projection, according to the Chinese Communist Party, then undoubtedly the Chinese Communist Party will have something to say about how Huawei operates abroad.
Let's talk about GCSB. There has been the Kim.com saga, which really has turned into somewhere between a circus and a farce. What does that mean for our relationship with the United States? I mean, you say that we're a first tier player in terms of the echelon network, in terms of intelligence with the United States, but they must look at what's been happening with Kim.com and throw their hands up in horror.
Well, certainly the way it's been handled has, at least according to the official story, has shown levels of incompetence that are really quite alarming. And we have to be very clear. Our intelligence partners are bound to look at this quite aghast that the GCSB could find itself in such a public debacle. Of course, intelligence agencies shun the limelight. They would prefer not to be observed, much less discussed about in public forums. And yet the GCSB is in fact involved in these public debates about what it did or did not do and the legality of its actions. This follows on the heels, of course, of several incidents involving the SIS, similarly involved in public debates about whether it's doing the right thing or it's a rogue agency. And our intelligence partners are bound to wonder about this. Now, I think that the official story may not cover the entirety of the .com saga, because .com was already under the microscope from U.S. authorities prior to his arrival in New Zealand. He had run afoul of them for a number of reasons. And so the idea that all of a sudden in New Zealand he started being spied on, quite frankly, is a bit ludicrous. He was being watched very closely. Why he chose to come to New Zealand when we have a police force that is very close to the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department was a strategic mistake on his part, clearly in hindsight. But the idea that the electronic observations, the monitoring of .com would stop at the point he arrived in New Zealand, I think is to not deal with the reality of intelligence collection. Again, because his issues with the United States were not exclusively about copyright infringement. There were other things involved that the United States felt were national security concerns. And that's where the FBI asked for help from the National Security Agency, which is the GCSB's partner in echelon. And my impression is that it was the NSA that may have done a handoff to the GCSB at the point of .com's arrival here. Again, the management of the story once it broke, I think, has been somewhat amateurish. I think that it could have been handled a lot better from everybody concerned.
Do we need to have a different form of governance of our security agencies?
Yes, I think we do. I think that one of the alarming things to me when I moved here, having come out of an intelligence background, was to discover that the oversight of both of our major intelligence agencies, the SIS and the GCSB, essentially rests in the hands of one person, and that's the Prime Minister as Minister of Intelligence and Security. There is an Inspector General, but the Inspector General, the charter requires that person to be a retired High Court justice. That means that this person will be elderly. They're very under-resourced. They have money for 0.5 of a position, a support position, and their offices and other resources, to include photocopying facilities, are within the SIS. So they're totally dependent on the agencies that they're supposed to investigate independently. So I'm afraid the Inspector General doesn't fulfill the oversight function that is required in a democracy, and leaving it to the Prime Minister opens a can of worms, because on the one hand, if the Prime Minister is very hands-on, then the possibility of the manipulation of intelligence flows for political purposes, unfortunately, raises its head. On the other hand, if the Prime Minister is very laissez-faire, is hands-off on that, then it opens the possibility for the agencies themselves to operate very loosely with the rules of their charter, if not in a rogue fashion, and that seems to have occurred in this .com case. The third component to this is that we do have a parliamentary oversight committee, but it is toothless. It cannot delve into operational details. It gets general summaries of what the intelligence community is doing once every 6 weeks. Again, it's not an effective committee. And I think that reform is needed to do two things. Make that parliamentary committee have effective oversight, which means they do get to know the operational details. And if that requires all of the committee members to get a security clearance that requires a polygraph, so be it. Let's do it. The second one is to change the charter of the Inspector General. I personally think the Inspector General's office should be expanded to 3 individuals, not necessarily judges, although one could still remain a judge, and that they don't necessarily have to be retired, and that whole office to be moved over to Parliament so that they're funded by the party system, not by the agencies they're supposed to investigate. That way you've got triangulation. Triangulation is the name of the game in intelligence. You get 3 independent sources verifying the same bit of information. If you can't get 3 independent sources, don't give it to the bosses. You get in trouble. By the same token, in a liberal democracy, our system of checks and balances requires us to have at least 3 independent sources of oversight. And here in New Zealand, we do not. And we're unique in that regard, because most of our counterparts, I would say all of the ones in echelon, have 3 sources of independent oversight that prevents the excesses, prevents the looseness that can get the country in trouble, at least in terms of, intelligence leaks and the like.
Our time's nearly to an end, but I have to ask you, as we're running very close to the US elections, what's your pick, Romney or Obama?
Although he's narrowed the gap, I think Romney's going to lose. Okay. And I think that the Democrats have been quite successful in pigeonholing Romney as an out-of-touch venture capitalist who really doesn't care about the little guy. And even though Romney had a good debate in the first debate with the president, debates don't decide elections. What they do is they confirm people's opinions one way or the other. I'm going to vote for Obama. And the reason I'm going to is I think he needs a second term to continue the economic recovery. And I prefer democratic foreign policy because it's more multilateral. It's, I'd hate to say it, less warmongering. The Republicans prefer bilateral approaches to international issues in a multipolar world that is increasingly intermingled with the globalization of production and exchange. I think that multilateral approaches, particularly in areas that do not have to do with the core national security interest, are the best way to go. So both because I think the president needs another 4 years to continue the economic recovery, and because I prefer the democratic approach to foreign policy, as opposed to, remember, Romney is not Reagan, and he's certainly not Richard Nixon. So he doesn't have a realist foreign policy a la Kissinger. His a mix of neoconservatism, and his foreign policy is a bit nebulous to me. Whereas the Democrats are very clear on how they approach the international community, and so for those reasons, as an American living abroad with the privilege to vote in not 1 but 2 countries, in this particular electoral cycle, I'm going to have to go with the Democrats.
We have covered a huge heap of ground. Dr. Buchanan, thank you so much for your expertise.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. And that's our program for this week. Thank you for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Ka kite anō.